Linux Luddites, episode 67, for the 20th of December, 2015. Hello and welcome to Linux Luddites, the show where we try all the latest free and open source software and then decide that we like the old stuff better. I'm Joe.
I'm Paddy.
And I am Jesse. And on this show, I talk to myself for about 10 minutes on a photo course. Then we have your feedback. And we round off by discussing the Remix Mini, an Android PC, which started its life on Kickstarter. And I would just like to make a little question to the audience. And well, I can ask you to as well as you're here. I have a lighting system in my lounge, and I use a little remote for turning the lights on and off. And the way it works is there's a plug which goes into the socket, and then that talks to the remote, and you can switch these three plugs on and off. So it's a sort of a shortwave RF type thing. And what I do is I plug all my lamps into it, and it means I can turn all my lamps on and off all at once or individually and set the mood as I see fit. And I've just been redoing my bedroom, and I've bought the same thing or a new version of it for my bedroom, so I can turn all my lights on and off and set the ambience and all those sorts of things. Great fun. The one I found comes with a GPIO module for the Raspberry Pi, so you can actually trigger these little adapter sockets with the Raspberry Pi. And I was just sort of wondering whether anyone had any particularly sort of different or odd kind of ideas. Like the one that I have, because I use it solely for lights, is if I can have it sitting there pinging my phone on the Wi-Fi, and when it doesn't see my phone for 20 minutes, it just turns all my lights off in my room, because that means that I've probably left the house and forgotten to turn the lights off. But because you can plug anything into the adapter, you could have it switch anything on or off, or control various bits and bobs depending on, sensors or other information you can pull in from your Wi-Fi. So it was the only reason I bought this one particularly was because you could get this little GPIO edition thing for like a tenner, and the possibility of things to control with these little remote switches I thought was almost endless. For example, I saw on the Amazon review, someone had it just pinging a server or any website, and as soon as the Raspberry Pi stopped getting a response, it turned the switch off, and he had the router plugged into the switch, so it just reset his router for him, and it meant that he always had internet. So I just thought I'd throw it out there as a quirky, fun little thing.
The first thing I thought of there was plugging a NAS or some sort of home server into it, and again using that Wi-Fi pinging so that it automatically turns that off and potentially back on again when you're in. Although I suppose you wouldn't want to just turn that straight off, would you? Although you probably could get the Raspberry Pi to send a command to the server to shut it down safely first, but that would save you a bit of power potentially.
Yeah, so the Plex server, if it's just sat there on, there's no point in it being on while I'm not in the house, if you don't want it to be serving. Yeah, that's a good idea. I hadn't thought of that.
I just assumed you were going to hook it up to a stereo that had Barry White on.
If in after midnight and two phones, blah, blah, blah. Yeah,
Nice. Right, well, before we go too far down that path, let's get on with the show and let's talk about this photo course. A couple of months ago, Riley Brandt Photography got in touch and asked us if we would like to review their open source photography tools course, which is a series of videos. Now, Paddy and I are not big photographers. Paddy, you don't even take pictures with your phone, so I don't think you were going to be making much use of this. And I take a few snaps with my phone, but that's about it. But you, Jesse, are into photography, at least at the hobbyist level. So you took them up on this offer. So what did you make of it?
Yeah, it seemed like too good an offer to pass up. So this is a FOSS course, which costs £50, and it uses entirely open source software. And in fact, Riley goes through his workflow on the website, and he uses things like an image viewer called Geeky, which I'd never actually heard of, Geeqie, and I've since run it, and it's incredibly peppy. He uses open source and open hardware monitor calibration tools, Rapid Photo Downloader, which we've discussed on the show before, Darktable, which is basically where the majority of this video course is based, and then GIMP, which also has some videos. So the course is broken down into 25 Darktable modules, 8 on GIMP, and then 4 sort of ancillary and supporting videos, which tell you things like how to do monitor calibration, what his workflow is, and just sort of how you might want to name your images and things to make it easier to work with.
There's about 5 hours worth of video there, isn't there?
Yeah, and as I said, the majority of that is all in Darktable. So you get a really good overview of all the various aspects. So he's a professional photographer, and he feels that it would be useful to teach people how to use Darktable. And I have to admit, when I've been messing around with my photos, I generally use less complicated tools and just tweaking some bits here and there, and mostly as JPEGs, whereas Darktable uses RAW files. So having done this course, and I've obviously got a whole load of RAW files in various things that I've taken, so I've been editing them, and I'm now very, very keen to stick with RAW, because you get a lot more flexibility and you can make a lot more changes after the effect. So the videos tend to be between about 8 and 12 minutes. So they're nice little snippets, and they're all very well labelled and very well broken down. So he covers things like the general overview of the whole program. So Darktable is split into a number of different areas. And in fact, he does mention that version 2 is about to come out. And so I went and downloaded that, compiled it and ran it rather than the one that's in the repositories. And they have more features coming out as you'd expect. So generally the overview is that there's a place called Lightroom, which is where you can look at the overview of your photos. Then there's Darktable, and then you can go on to print and do some other things, which generally he didn't look at. But it does allow people who have not a lot of experience or knowledge of photography and editing photos to get straight into it, because he takes some time at the start to, as I said, describe how to download your photos, describe how he does his filing, and give you a nice overview of the program. And he goes through various tips and tweaks all the way through. And this is the thing that really sort of resonated as we were watching the videos, is he clearly uses it himself. He clearly is doing this as an experienced photographer who uses it day to day. So throughout the whole course, he's saying, oh, I use this shortcut and I double click here to do this. And my preference is to have these settings and these things turned on and those things turned off, and the reason why, and the reason that he uses the workflow in the way he does. And rather than just saying, oh, this is that, this is the other thing, he sort of gives examples as to why, and he goes through it very slowly, very methodically, but not at a dragging pace. So it's really well thought out. He doesn't and ah, he doesn't sort of make large pauses and wonder what he's going to do next. He's clearly thought them through logically and goes through a sensible pace. So once you've done things like the overview and got all your files downloaded and imported, he goes through the basics. So how to amend exposure is one video, how to affect the white balance, crop and rotate, shadows and highlights. And the other thing I noticed is that sometimes people can do things on the screen which you can't actually tell they're doing it without being there. So my example would be, if you wanted to move a window around your computer, you obviously hold the mouse button and move it around. But if you don't know that you can hold a mouse button, if that concept has never been taught to you, and you're watching a video of someone doing it, they don't know that you're holding the mouse button unless you explain what you're doing. So in the crop and rotate video, for example, he says that, right, once you've selected the crop that you want, double click on the image and it instigates that crop. And so by explaining it exactly how he's doing it, you're able to follow and know the various shortcuts. And there's a lot of shortcuts that he uses on the keyboard, which is really, really good, because I didn't know any of them. I know I've messed around with Darktable previously and not got very far, but knowing how you can sort of hide bits of information you don't want or quickly jump between the Lightroom and Darktable and things really, really helps you use the program.
So supposing someone has just gone out and bought quite a nice camera that can take raw images, and they've never messed around with Photoshop or GIMP or Darktable or anything like that before. Is this the right course for them, do you think? Is it an introduction, or is it more for people who have already got some experience?
Oh, it's definitely for introduction level. It takes you from not really understanding the difference between white balance, highlights, exposure, things like this, and runs you through all the metrics you can tweak and shows you going backwards and forwards. So once he makes a change, he'll often go backwards and forwards 2 or 3 times to show you what he's done and why he's done it. So it definitely is for the introduction and people who, as you say, have got a nice new camera and just want to maybe tweak a photo before they print it, or just make some colours pop a bit more. Because what you find is that when you buy a small digital camera or your phone, for example, the image they take gets pre-processed without you doing anything. So the image looks more vibrant, more colourful, just to make it more appealing to the eye, because they know those people aren't going to tinker with them. They're not in RAW. They're not going to go and download it to their PC and edit it. Whereas if you have a DSLR, they still have that sort of post-editing on. They still do some work to make it look better, but generally not as much. So what you find with DSLRs is the photos look a bit dull and a bit dry, but in actual fact it's more true to the image that you're taking. So this is therefore why you need to often go in and just, bring up the greens for maybe a landscape photo, or bring up the shadows and the highlights to make people's faces a bit more sort of contextual. So it is definitely for the new user and someone who needs an introduction.
So it sounds like you have enjoyed this course and definitely seen some value in it, but it's maybe hard for you to answer this question because you offered it for free for review purposes. But if you had to pay for it, do you think that you would? Basically what I'm asking is, do you think it's good value for money?
So the problem, I think, nowadays is that if you want to learn how to do something, there's a million videos on YouTube, there's all sorts of websites you can go to and you can read through things. But if you're like me and you're trying to do something for the first time, I was replumbing my radiator, for example, and I thought, how do I do this particular bit? I went on YouTube. I must have spent 20 minutes, half an hour looking through different videos until I found one that was the right level of detail, but fast enough, but also thorough enough. And while everyone can make a video and upload it, not everyone is good at making a video. Whereas this is a very well-structured, well-paced set of tutorials. And as I say, he's a real expert in his field, so it makes sure that you follow along. I mean, he's definitely a perfectionist, because there's maybe a slider you can edit, and he'll say, oh look, this slider goes up and down and this is the change it makes, and he'll say, okay, so I'll just nudge it up a bit and show you that. Oh no, back down a bit. Oh no, back up a bit. Oh, that's not quite right. And he, despite the fact that all he has to do is show you what the slider does, he's a perfectionist, and you'll see him adjust it 5 or 6 times just to get the photo, just so. So there's a certain love about the way he's doing it. And I think that's what you're paying for, is you're paying for someone who has sat down and thought about it and has done it in a sensible and organised manner. And you're going to get a quality product at the end of it. Yes, you could go and find this information for free. Of course you can. You could sit and read the book on how to use Darktable. You could watch various YouTube videos. But would you get it as quickly? Would you get the full information that he's packing into these videos? I'm not sure you would. Now, I would definitely pay for it. $50... I mean, I'm not flush at the moment. I've just redone my room, and so the money's a little bit tight. So it would be something that I would treat myself to. But it would be definitely $50 well spent, because, as Paddy said at the start, this is 5 hours worth of video. It's a lot of information packed into those. It's 25 videos, and I have to say, I've watched them, and I'm definitely going to go back and watch them again, because there are bits that you miss or that you just need to have refreshed. And because they're cut into such nice little chapters, it's quite easy to go back and say, okay, what was the one about masks? What was the one about highlights? Things like this. So you can go back and specifically refresh your memory. So, of course, there's always this issue about paying for stuff, but I think that actually $50 is very reasonable for the amount of information that's packed into them. And if you want to get a known place for quality and purely FOSS, I mean, he's running it all on GNOME 3, and all of the other tools that he uses show his appreciation for FOSS, then this is definitely the right way to do it. Plus, 10% of the money spent goes to supporting FOSS programs, so I suspect it goes back to help those photography programs that I mentioned at the top. And therefore, he is also doing something to support the community at the same time.
Well, $50 for 5 hours of DRM-free tutorial videos by a real expert sounds like pretty good value to me. So it sounds like thumbs up. On to the feedback then. And first of all, a huge thanks to Gregory Anastasi for your PayPal donation. And of course to our monthly supporters. Very much appreciate it, guys.
It certainly is. Thanks, guys.
And it always says contact details. So show@linuxluddites.com. Or you can find us on Twitter or Google Plus or Facebook, or leave a comment on the website.
Yeah, we got a message in from Enrique who was asking whether or not the T-shirts that we sell on the website are available in other countries other than the UK. So to answer him and anyone else who has that query, yes, the company we use, Spreadshirt, do international shipping, so anyone can buy them, and T-shirts and lanyards and mugs and things. So go and have a look and support the show. And we kick off the feedback this fortnight with a couple of corrections. So first off from Henry Sprogg, who said, on the subject of a project administrator for OggCamp, I apologise for the confusion, as the last thing I was suggesting was someone to act as a boss. In fact, I meant the complete opposite. The role of an administrator, as I see it, is to assist the engineer or the manager with all of the mundane but nonetheless important tasks of documenting what has been agreed, who is to deliver it, and by when. This allows the organising team to deliver what they've agreed to deliver. I think the confusion came when I said, better if they have a strong personality. However, I was not suggesting that they run the show. They are the support, and as such have to be confident enough to identify back to the organising team any issues they identify for the team to resolve, e.g. the venue not booked by the agreed date, etc. So it wasn't quite the sort of overlord that we made it out to be in his original email last fortnight.
I'm still a little bit confused because it just pretty much sounds like members of the team that exist already. I suppose no one is assigned that specific job maybe, but that's kind of shared between a few people. I suppose what he's getting at is just get one person doing all of the admin, I suppose. Yeah, project administrator. Makes sense.
Well, changing tack completely then, and onto the topic of menus, which we discussed recently. Steve Russell got in touch and said, sorry for confusing you regarding the 2-column menu comments. That was referring to the previous times the three of you have discussed searchable menus, which was probably about 6 months ago now. I remember at the time Paddy saying how he feels that a single-column menu is easier for the brain to process, etc. And Steve agrees with me. Those comments probably sound a little out of context in my email, with no reference to that.
Yeah, it's difficult if you're going to be emailing about stuff that happened 6 months ago and we've just spoken about it the week or so before. So there was that confusion there. But I mean, on the topic of searchable menus, which a number of people got in touch about, Nathan D. Smith said, I submit to Paddy that a searchable menu is more in line with the crusty history of computing than hierarchical menus. And I'm not really sure what he's getting at. Do you know where he's coming from? Is there some sort of historical thing that I've somehow skipped over?
I don't know, because I would probably disagree with him. I mean, the earliest menus I can think of are hierarchical, although it's just a question of how they're displayed. I mean, we're used to cascading menus, visibly cascading menus now, but a lot of very old software still had hierarchical menus. It's just you only saw one set of menu options at a time on the screen because it was on a teletype. And even things like, VisiCalc, say, which had a menu system which would be unrecognisable by most people today, that was still a hierarchical menu system. Admittedly, it was one key at a time, but you could string commands together. So I really don't know where Nathan's coming from. I think hierarchical menus as a concept have been around an awful long time. How they've displayed and the way we have cascading menus these days is a slightly newer facet of the same basic idea.
Yeah, I mean, hierarchical menus are the organising method which people have used in foldering and all that sort of stuff for centuries and centuries. So it just makes sense in our head, doesn't it? Having that logical, this is where I'm grouping all these things, and then subgroups of those things and further subgroups to find the one thing you're specifically looking for.
Yeah, and Keith Seji got in touch with quite a long email that we won't read out, but the crux of it pretty much was KDE is the answer to this. It's very easy to get what we want with KDE, but he knows that we're not going to use it and we're just going to dismiss it and say, oh, no, we don't like KDE on this show. So I'm afraid you're pretty much right, Keith. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, the problem with KDE is it's quite bloated and it just doesn't feel right.
Yeah, that's exactly what Keith wrote. So, well, you know us too well, Keith. What can we say? Well, changing topic again to high-performance computing, Jason Simmons got in touch and said, In episode 62, you discussed the HPC market and the level of spend that companies undertake on IT in general, and yet 2/3 do not get any return on that spend. Paddy mentioned a very important point that the products are now throwaway and quickly replaced by the latest shiny fad. At first glance, this looks like a benefit to the tech industry, but is actually poisonous for both industry and the customers. It's poisonous because it creates a feedback loop of mutual distrust between the industry and the customers. Customers add to this feedback by demanding the planet on a stick for free. The industry then reacts by promising the planet on a stick for free for everybody. The industry indoctrinates the customer to not apply any analysis or thought into what their requirements are. The customer buys the latest tool and it does not work because it does not fit their business needs, adding to the strength of this poisonous feedback loop. As the feedback loop increases, the profit lowers, the sale conversion time lengthens, and the advertising becomes more aggressive and invasive to privacy.
Do you get the impression that Jason maybe works closely in this industry and sort of sees it firsthand?
Yeah, it does sound like he's quite involved with this industry. So I suppose it would be unwise to try and disagree. And most of what you said there, Jason, does actually make sense.
Well, we seem to be skipping between topics a fair bit tonight, and let's maintain that. And Gurdnark got in touch and said, I've always thought that the audience for Crunchbang was users who were neither newbies nor so advanced that they build distros from scratch. I thought that its user base was folks who want something stable, lightweight, and yet want to be able to tinker a bit. When I want to run a box based directly on Debian, rather than based on Debian by way of Ubuntu, I run Q4OS. Here I get a lightweight experience, rock-solid Debian base, out-of-the-box codecs, great Mate-like start menu at installation, easy program installation, and the amusing Trinity desktop. As the Crunchbang founder noted, I think it's the advances in Debian that raise a question about the need for Bunsen labs. Now, we talked about Q4OS on the show a few times because I've extolled its virtues, and I've always been met by scorn from Joe. Are you still maintaining that posture?
Yeah, I tried it out on the Raspberry Pi, and I still don't like Trinity, really. I much prefer something like LXD or Mate. I think it's just a personal choice, really. I can definitely see the merits of Q4OS if you're into that kind of thing, you know, the old KDE, because it is very lightweight and it's sort of similar to Mate, but instead of GTK, it's Qt based. So it's not for everyone. It's not for me, but it clearly is for some people.
And Trinity's the fork of KDE 3, is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I don't like it.
More opinions with no evidence. Just what we get criticised for all the time.
We discussed it on, I think it was a news item a couple of months ago. I remember looking through it and looking at the history of Trinity and bits and bobs, and nothing about it sort of piqued my interest. But I do think Gudnark is right, where the classic kind of Crunchbang user was someone who knew what they were doing, but kind of didn't want the effort of having to go through Debian, getting it to sort of a nice position where it looks good and you can crack on with it. But I suppose Debian has come forward a bit more, and you know, hence why Core Nominal sort of stepped down. But there was a huge backing behind Crunchbang, and so you know, Bunsen Labs has taken up the flame, if you excuse the pun, and has run with it.
That was terrible, man.
Okay, let's get us off quickly. So, switch over to Kickstarter. And there was a discussion on our Google Plus page, started by Russell Dickinson, about Kickstarter and why people were donating. And there was sort of a bit of back and forth. But of the various discussion points, I've pulled out Popey's one, because it sort of summarizes someone who has had quite a big hit rate with Kickstarter. So I hope he doesn't mind. I'll just go through these numbers he's put in there. So Popey said, okay, I just did an audit of the 48 crowdfunding campaigns I've backed across Kickstarter and Indiegogo since May 2012. Maybe interesting stats for you. So of those 48, he has 2 that were cancelled before the end of the campaign, 4 which were unsuccessful, i.e. they didn't reach the funding target, and 42 which were successful. And only one of those successfully funded ones he later demanded a refund from. So the 42 that were successful, 5 hadn't arrived at the time of writing. 1 hadn't arrived and was over a year in development, but he puts that there were lots of regular updates, so has a confidence that it will turn up. And two of them, of those 42, didn't get made, and one he got a refund on, and the other just sort of stopped and fizzled out. So I think out of 42, given that only one, as far as I can see, okay, granted, 6 haven't yet been delivered, and they are to be seen, but assuming they do, because they're apparently fairly recently been kickstarted, funded, let's go with, I think that's a fairly good kind of return, don't you, chaps?
Well, put it this way. If you said to me that you'd bought 42 things from Amazon and even one of them had not turned up and you hadn't got your money back, I don't think you'd be very pleased, would you?
It's a bit apples and oranges. You know, Amazon, you know they've got it in a cupboard somewhere, whereas this place, someone's got to design it from scratch. If I went out into the free market and said, for this amount of money, I want you to design me something that no one's ever come up with before, and only 1 out of 40 didn't succeed, I'd be quite happy, I think.
I like how you've compared Amazon to like your grandma's house. She goes back and rummages in a cupboard somewhere for the thing that you want, rather than an enormous industrialized warehouse. But yeah, well, I'll take the point though.
Yeah, but I think you're wrong, Jesse. The point here is that people don't see it that way. We might understand it actually works that way, but they make a big point of not playing up that aspect of the business. As far as Kickstarter and Indiegogo and all these other sites sell themselves, these are products you can actually put money into and you'll get them. And it is more like a sales pitch you get rather than it's a bit of a gamble, toss your money and you might get something at the end of the day pitch.
But I fear that's come about because of people who are making this work, or people who have something new that could go somewhere else to get it developed, get independent funding. And it's actually now easier to ask for the funding off of people. And so it has slightly changed. I think when it first came out, it was very much a case of throw your money in and hope there was a bit more of a risk to go there. But where, like, look at the Pebble Watch, for example. The first Pebble Watch was as far as I can see, and I haven't done a lot of research, but as far as I can see, it was a genuine Kickstarter example. The second Pebble Watch, they could have got funded because they knew they were popular, and all they did was go on there as a way of having a storefront effectively and maintaining the hype. And as people do that, it becomes more and more like a shop and less like the risky kind of gamble that I think we're talking about, that people see it as it is.
Yeah, I think the gambling side of it is something they certainly don't play up at all. I mean, they make their money whatever happens, don't they? They take their cut and don't happily refund a lot of the time. I mean, that's what struck me. I'll put a little note in here about the Xano thing we were talking about last time around. And rather than actually refunding people all the money they've lost here, what Kickstarter are doing is hiring a journalist to go and write a story about it and how, bad things have happened and how could this have come to pass? I mean, it is just whitewashing, isn't it?
Well, I like how in the blog post about it, this journalist says that they're paying me to do it, but I'm going to be totally independent and not take any sides, which it's a bit difficult to believe that, isn't it? Given that he's being paid by Kickstarter, it is almost definitely going to be just a fluff piece, isn't it?
Yeah, so I figure the guys who are making the Xano have just basically spent all the money and that's it. They haven't produced anything, or they've produced like 10 terrible drones or whatever it is they've done so far, and no one's culpable, no one's going to get anything back because the money's just disappeared. And there seems to be no way of claiming anything at all. It all seems very black market.
Yeah, and the thing that gets me about this story, of course, is that as far as I know, and I could be wrong if I am correct, mate, Kickstarter themselves have taken commission from this, and they're keeping hold of that commission, and they're spending a very small amount of that to actually get this journalist to write a piece explaining what happened, rather than giving any of the money back to the backers.
Yeah, I suppose you could expect them or hope that they would give at least the commission they made off that project back to the backers. So even if that's only a small percentage of the money that they laid out in the first place, at least it'd be something.
Anyway, it's not just us who are cynical about this, because Ian Barton got in touch and said, I've just had a quick read through the Kickstarter starting a project docs. Although they do suggest setting a budget, there seems to be no obligation on projects to either provide an initial budget that is visible to the public or provide any financial statement once the project is funded and underway. This seems to be a major opportunity for fraud, particularly on larger projects. I can just imagine my bank's response if I tried to borrow £100,000 without providing these basic items of information. I suspect I've missed something obvious. Or do people treat Kickstarter donations a bit like chucking money into a wishing well?
Well, that's kind of how I feel about it. It's a gamble, not necessarily a wishing well, but it's a bit like buying from an eBay listing that you feel is a little bit dodgy, or at least what it used to be like, because now it's much easier to get your money back on eBay. But put it this way, I would never back anything on Kickstarter or spend any money on Kickstarter that I couldn't afford to lose. You know, you just assume that you're probably not going to get the thing, and it'd be nice if you do. So if it's 20 or 30 quid, then that's annoying to lose. Maybe 50 quid. But anything more than that, I'm very reluctant. These things that are a few hundred, I'm just not going to do that, I'm afraid.
Yeah, so we've mentioned a few of the laptops that are coming out, and we've generally been talking about the free laptops, but you can obviously find other laptops and other hardware which has something unique or not seen before, what have you. But I wouldn't go on Kickstarter and buy a £2,000 laptop. It's just, like you say, it's just far too much money to risk. And the only way you would hope to not lose that money is if they just don't get funded in the first place and your money comes back to you. So, yeah, I think it's, like you say, if you're willing to lose that £20 or accept that you could, and maybe the ones that Popey's mentioned are all low-cost ones, then that's the way I would play it.
Well, we had a pretty positive response to our look at Ubuntu Mate on the Raspberry Pi. Nigel Rarity and Martin Wimpress got in touch. Martin thanked us for looking at it and said it was valuable feedback. And he said he's working on the issues that we talked about, like resizing the partitions and the little bug in the welcome application with the toggling of proprietary software. And he said that they're working on a 15.10.1 release, which should be available soon. So look out for that.
Yeah, Martin pointed out that he made all the nice little flashy sort of movements in the welcome screen and the animations just to annoy Joe, and apparently there's going to be even more. But away from the Mate version for the Raspberry Pi, the actual main release, Raspbian, has got a new graphical software manager. But I've not actually looked at it myself. I'm guessing, given your sort of fingers in Raspberry Pis, you have looked at it, Joe?
Yeah, it's pretty much a fork of the GNOME Software Center, and it works pretty well, except for the updates, which I tried to do and didn't work very well. So I think that needs a bit of tweaking. But one of the points that we'd made previously about Raspbian was that there's no graphical package manager and no way to do updates via GUI, which you now can do, at least in theory. The updates, as I said, was sketchy for me, but I don't know what that was about. Hopefully that'll be sorted soon. So I just thought it was worth bringing that up.
Yeah, very good. And that brings us to the end of the feedback. And so we're going to talk about another mini device, the Remix Mini.
We've often had the debate on this show about whether mobile devices are proper computers or not. And I have clearly stated that if it's got a processor and RAM and some sort of operating system, then it is a computer. And some people say, well, when you get down to Internet of Things devices, then maybe they're not a proper computer. But certainly things like phones and tablets are, as far as I'm concerned. And a mistake that a lot of people make is that just because the operating system and the user interface on that device doesn't resemble a traditional computer, it's easy, or you could be forgiven for thinking that it is something different. Well, we get donations on this show, and we have a little bit of a surplus after we pay for the server and domain and all that kind of stuff. And so that allows us to buy things occasionally. And something that we bought fairly recently was the Remix Mini. Now, what the Remix Mini is, it was touted as the world's first true Android desktop computer. And so when Paddy alerted me to this Kickstarter, I jumped straight on it and paid about £40 of UK money, and it was delivered almost on time. It was probably, I got it, I think, maybe 3 weeks after they said that I should have got it, which for a Kickstarter is not too bad. We talked about that kind of a bit of a gamble. And I think for £40, it was worth the risk. And that risk paid off. And so now we're going to talk about it. So what you get in the box is a tiny little, I suppose, Roku-sized machine with a few ports on it, a couple of USB ports, power, micro SD card, and HDMI out, and also audio out. And the promise of this thing is that it is running Android, but it has a traditional desktop user interface.
Yeah, so it's got built-in Wi-Fi, so you can connect up that way. It's got a RJ45 jack, so you can connect it to your LAN. And as you said, USB ports, so you just plug in a USB mouse and keyboard, and you've got effectively, like I say, very much a Roku-sized kind of puck PC, which gives you Android on your desktop, but it has windowed applications and a menu and things like this. So you get that sort of WIMP-type interface, but with the benefit of it being on Android with all the apps that they have. And let's be honest, it's basically like a Chrome OS, but with the full suite of Android apps, which aren't quite available on Chrome OS. So you get sort of a strange halfway ground, and hence we had a little look at it.
Well, I had a bit of a false start with it because I plugged it into my old Dell monitor, which is 4.3, and it's... I don't know, I can't remember the resolution of it. It's not particularly high resolution, but it's not a widescreen monitor. And the Remix Mini did not like that one bit, I'm afraid.
Well, this is going to be one of my first complaints about this little box, which I'm actually holding in my hand. And it is a wee little thing, and it only weighs in at about 4 3/4 ounces. So you get an impression of as you say, a little Roku device. And my complaint is it hasn't got a VGA connector. It has only got HDMI for video out. And I know it's a drum I bang on a fairly frequent basis, and a lot of people have never even seen a box that's got a VGA port on these days. Everything's been HDMI for so long. I really would have preferred there to be that port there rather than having to use a converter if I did want to plug it into my monitor, which I couldn't do because I haven't got that connector. So this ended up being connected to my television, and obviously with TV resolutions being so much lower than proper monitors, that gives you a totally different experience.
Well, in their defense, they were trying to make something cheap, much like the Raspberry Pi. And when the first Raspberry Pi came out, I read into why there was no VGA connector on that. And it turns out that it is much more expensive to do that, prohibitively so. And so you'd think, oh, well, it's just soldering that connector on, but it's not. It's the rest of the circuitry that goes with it can seriously increase your manufacturing costs. So instead of it being a 40 quid device, who knows how much it would have been? It might have been 60 or more. So I can see why they've done it. They've cut costs where they can. Like there's no USB 3, for example, and it's a fairly modest set of specs in terms of system on a chip and RAM and that sort of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And you haven't got a microphone port, for instance. And you talk about the system on a chip there. I mean, this is an all-winner A53, which retails for $5. So, I mean, it's not a very expensive board inside this, so that I'm sure there's a little bit of wiggle room there on the manufacturing cost side of things.
Okay, fair enough.
Well, while we're talking about the actual hardware, I don't know if you noticed another Kickstarter that is now on the go for the Pine 64.
No, I haven't seen that.
Okay, via the magic of podcasting, let me just put a link in the show notes for you.
Well, while Joe has a quick look at that, surely some of the costs associated with this are not just the physical hardware. We're talking about also the fact that someone's had to spend the time to do all of the software changes that are required to make Android into a WIMP type desktop that you can have as a normal PC. So if that little computer is roughly the same spec, then this means it's 40 minus 15, £25 for them to do the software side of things, which isn't so unreasonable.
Yeah, I'm not suggesting it is. I mean, all I'm trying to point out is that I don't think people should be or will be buying the Remix Mini for the hardware. They'll be buying it for the software, and for exactly the reasons you spelled out there, that it's about the only thing going that offers this functionality on Android. And yeah, I think it's perfectly reasonable for them to make a small amount of money to actually recoup the cost there.
Yeah, you can buy this now in the UK for £45 from Amazon. So even the final retail version has been fairly affordable, I think. And for what you get, I mean, I saw a review that said that it's not the cheapest, but it's not the most expensive. So I think it's a reasonable price. It might be a little bit expensive for what you're actually getting specs-wise, but it's this software experience, as you say, Paddy, that is makes it really worthwhile and why we're actually looking at it. That said, unfortunately, this is not open source, is it?
No, it's not. And I guess that's the really big story here before we even talk about the device in question. I mean, why have Google dragged their feet on this for so many years? I mean, we've spoken in the past before about when people have done windowing on Android, and we've spoken about how Google stomped down on the CyanogenMod guys when they were proposing to roll it in and stop them from doing so on pain of having access withdrawn. I mean, why? Just why?
Well, the answer up until now has been Chrome OS, but there seems to be increasing chatter that Chrome OS and Android will be merged. So I don't really know whether that's true or not, but if it is true, then it doesn't really make sense that Google have been so reluctant to let people have a proper desktop experience on Android.
Yeah, and as you say, it is a proprietary license, and they appear to only be willing to deal with OEMs and putting it out on their own devices. But I still think it's worthwhile talking about and looking at because it gives us an insight into how Android could be and probably will be as and when Google finally get around to doing something with it on the multi-window front, or some enterprising free and open source software dudes could come along and do something very similar.
Yeah, I mean, they could take AOSP and put a similar, write a similar interface on top of it. And apart from anything else, I think this gives us a glimpse of convergence, potentially. Certainly convergence with regards to Android, because you could have two separate launchers and some smart way of knowing which launcher to use, whether it's a standard one like ADW when you're holding it in your hand on the phone, but when you plug it in, suddenly this other new, as yet unwritten launcher happens that's similar to Remix OS. And there you go. That's convergence sorted for you.
We've talked around it a fair bit. I mean, shall we dive into what happens when you first plug it in? I mean, other than the preposterously short 50 centimetre HDMI cable you get, which isn't going to be much use to many people.
Yeah, that was a stretch goal, I think, of the Kickstarter, that they'd include an HDMI cable. And it's as if they took it as literally as possible. Okay, we will provide an HDMI cable. It is technically one, even though it is totally useless. Although it's not useless to me because I've got a coupler, and so it added another 50 centimeters to mine, which actually proved really useful. So I found some use for it. But yeah, well, you never know. If you had just the perfect setup, you might possibly be able to use it. But yeah, once you plug it in, you try and turn it on, and unless you read the documentation or have read reviews or seen videos of it or whatever, then you don't know that it hasn't got a button on it. It's got a sort of a capacitive button on the top. You just kind of lightly tap the top and then it springs into life.
Yeah, I had real problems with that button. I couldn't work out if I was turning it on or if I was turning it off while it was still trying to boot, or what was going on. And it's only got one light that shows you, this tiny little green light that tells you whether it's on or not. And there's not even any lights on the RJ45, so you can't even tell if it's, receiving and sending network traffic and things. I just found working out whether it had turned on to be a really problematic thing, and that was, once it's on, it was going, but I really found knowing whether or not I turned it on to be an issue. So that secret super slick button was just useless as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, and it's really easy to turn it off by mistake as well, which I did several times when I was picking it up and waving it around, trying to get decent Wi-Fi reception, which, to be honest, goes back to the 50 centimetre HDMI cable, because I would guess a lot of people would plug it in, shove it behind the telly, and then wonder why on earth they can't actually get any download speed. And it's because it has got such a lousy wireless aerial built in. You do need it actually out and not hidden behind other electronic equipment, I think.
Okay, I didn't have it very far from my router, but it didn't pick up on my new fancy AC network, my 5 gigahertz one. So it was stuck on the old 2.4, which is fairly slow. I mean, I had it for years, and now it just seems totally useless to me. I would never use it unless I had to. But yeah, Wi-Fi performance, I found was all right, but not amazing.
Yeah, it's interesting because I've got fairly shocking Wi-Fi here. But even so, I normally get about 20 megs down, and I was only getting about 3 megs using this device, no matter where I had it, including right adjacent to the router.
Oh, well, I didn't do any speed tests specifically, but I just used it day to day, and I had no problem streaming from YouTube and stuff like that.
Oh, well, I guess that's good to know for anyone thinking about getting one of these then, because I couldn't watch YouTube because it was forever buffering, and I wasn't sure if it was the actual device running slowly or the network traffic, and clearly it's the network.
Did you try it plugged into the Ethernet port then?
I didn't know because I don't think many people would use it that way, to be honest. I mean, it is going to be plugged into your telly, and how many people have got a RJ45 socket next to their telly?
Well, in some high-end flats and stuff, you have that. But yeah, I think your average person probably wouldn't have that.
Thank you, Joe. You just referenced my flat as a high-end flat. I'll take that. So upon first boot, you obviously get the Android login, and I was pleased to see that the two-factor authentication worked. So that was a plus. It has quite a reasonable boot up time. I suppose if you're going to leave it under your TV or on your desk, then you're not really worried too much about how quick it is. It's fairly reasonable. And once you're on and it's going, you get, as we've described, a desktop. It's got a start menu in the bottom and a panel along the bottom which shows icons for open applications. And surprisingly, when you load apps, because they are Android apps, they load in Windows. And so when you sort of full screen one, you get the biggest you could possibly get if you sort of picture perhaps a big tablet sort of view of it. And then when you go to shrink it down to windowed, it sort of shrinks back to the phone size. And then you can drag it as well. But the dragging of the window resizing was a bit kind of iffy on the apps that I tried it on. So you're best sort of sticking with the phone size or the full size tablet, if you will.
Yeah, I thought it was a bit clunky as well. I mean, something that was missing that would have been a good idea would be dragging to the side and snapping windows in place, and it doesn't support that at the moment.
You love your window snapping, don't you, Paddy? I don't really, so I didn't miss it, I must say. But one thing that I should say, I got this first. I don't know if you guys experienced this, but when I first turned it on, the first thing it did was update itself to the newest version of Remix OS, which I thought was quite nice, that you didn't have to manually go in and start searching for updates.
Yeah, when I booted up, it said it was already up to date, so that must have been following the work you had done. But also the time was wrong. This is something that stuck with me and annoyed me. That it's plugged into a network, it sees the internet. Get the time right. I don't understand how it could possibly have that wrong, but there was that.
Well, if you look at the settings, you'll notice it thinks you're in Shanghai. That's why the time's wrong.
Yep.
Ah, okay. I just put it down as it being stupid.
Yeah, and the only languages available, I think, were US English, Chinese, and a couple of others. So there was no English or traditional English. It was only simplified, unfortunately.
So if you're familiar with Android, which I assume most listeners are, you can have widgets and things. So it did allow you to put widgets on the desktop, but they didn't really show up. So if you were to go and select the widgets you wanted, the desktop popped into like sort of a mock grid type thing, and you could then place the widgets as you wanted to have, your clock and maybe your sort of bus tracker and other bits and bobs, weather and things. But then when you went back, you said, yep, save that, and went back to the desktop, they all disappeared. And you had to then go and sort of open the widget view to see the widgets, which defeats the point entirely of having widgets on your desktop or widgets at all.
Yeah, that is definitely something they could improve upon, I think. But the first thing I always do with things is see what else it can do. And so I thought, right, I'm going to install ADW launcher on it and have a traditional Android experience, even though that's completely against the whole point of why we're talking about this. But when I tried to do that, it just said alternative launchers not supported. So bit of a shame that it's not that hackable, although it does have a recovery mode and it looks like the bootloader's unlocked. There weren't any ROMs to flash onto it, but it looks like if and when there are other alternative ROMs, it should be very straightforward to do that. So it does seem like a hackable piece of hardware. So potentially you might be able to put this mythical open source version of Android that has a desktop on it at some stage if the ROM's made available.
Oh, well, you've touched on installing things there. So what's another actual application that you did install, and how did that go?
Well, I installed AntennaPod, which is probably my most used application on my phone, apart from Chrome, maybe. And that seemed to work absolutely perfectly. That's a podcasting client.
Yeah, and I got my daughter to play with this for a few hours. She's fairly adept with Android these days. And we discovered that Crossy Road doesn't work, which apparently is some sort of Frogger thing people play with these days. But a lot of other games actually do.
I tried installing a couple of games, and I found one called Crush and Rush, or Rush and Crush. It was a car driving game. And you couldn't even get past the welcome screen. You couldn't click on it. It didn't accept your input to say yes, click, or even where to type your name in. And so you couldn't go anywhere. So you had to just exit out and leave it. And I kept on coming across touch-based problems. So a couple of examples. Maps. Ridiculous. You can double-click to zoom in, and you can scroll, but the scroll wheel on the mouse just moves you up and down the map. And there's no zoom out button on the Android app because it assumes you're touching the screen. Whereas if you load Google Maps on a normal desktop, you get sort of a plus minus buttons. But on the phone, they assume you're going to be using your fingers for pinching to zoom. And I could not zoom out of a map because there's no way of pinching to zoom when you've got a mouse. And just the fact that I just kept on zooming in, and no matter what I did, I couldn't zoom out again, just infuriated me.
Yeah, there's clearly something they've thought about, though. I mean, it doesn't work very well what they've done, but if you went into the experimental features bit in their settings menu, you can actually turn on something, so you can use Control-Alt and click dragging to emulate pinch to zoom.
Okay, so that may have worked for the maps. My another annoyance I had with the touch to, the movement from touch interface to mouse interface is that when I opened Google Docs, which firstly, you couldn't actually use the up-down arrows to go past a line in the doc. So when we lay out our docs for this show, we put lines to break various sections, and you couldn't go past that because it didn't sort of recognize the line as an item to go past. So that was a nightmare. But when I wanted to select a bunch of text, you dragged the mouse across a paragraph, it dragged the window up and down as if you were touching the window to scroll. So I couldn't even select a paragraph of text with just the most basic sort of function of a word processor. And it's that sort of zooming into a map more than I want and not being able to click and drag. It's just infuriating.
Yeah, I don't know if what you're describing there is something I experienced, which is when it's working, it works generally okay. But as soon as something starts going wrong with the interface, and for instance, I had problems with their actual own file manager, and as soon as you've had a problem, it seems to affect all the other apps, and it obviously throws something off in the whole software stack that then affects any other app.
Yeah, I did find that, and just a reboot was the answer to that.
That's not an answer.
Yeah, turn it off and on again. The first rule of IT, man.
Yeah, but if you're just trying to use an application and it destroys all the other applications, you have to reboot it. That's hardly, except killing that app and moving on. But I don't accept having to reboot the whole blooming thing just to get everything working again.
Yeah, I know. Obviously, I was just joking there, but Android at the best of times, even on a Nexus device with a totally stock ROM, I find that it's a little bit ropey and unstable. So I wasn't at all surprised to find that this was a little bit ropey and having to reboot it every now and again. So it's pretty much what I expected. One problem I had was that not all apps like to behave when it comes to windowing, do they? Like YouTube, for example, just expects to be full screen, and I felt like I was fighting with it to try and put it in the background. For instance, if it's playing a video, you can't minimize it and have the audio keep playing. It's that problem we've talked about on our phones, which you don't seem to have because you pay them loads of money every month. But Paddy and I can't, for example, listen to a YouTube video, a song or whatever, or someone speaking and do other things. So that I found very frustrating.
Yeah, I do pay them loads of money every month, and one of the things that I do that for is for Google Music. So I installed Google Music thinking, I'll just get some tunes going while I carry on with this review, because there's a standard headphone jack in the back of it. But Google Music wouldn't play, and it's just like I kept on coming across problem after problem after problem, and it was the most infuriating thing. And this may well be coming across. I did not have a happy time with the Remix Mini.
Yeah, I had problems with a variety of apps. I mean, Gmail's a good example. It starts up in windowed mode, which looks just like a phone. But if you maximise it, at least on my television, and it could be down to the resolution of my television, which is only some dodgy 720p thing, it stays in that mode. It doesn't switch into tablet mode, so you get a list of messages down one side and previews on the other. It's just a huge, great big long list of messages, which is no use to man or beast. But just going back to what you've both been saying, I think a lot of our problems with this are down to expectations. And we have an expectation that phones and tablets are going to need rebooting and that Android is a bit flaky. But suddenly when you're presented with it as a desktop, your expectation is it's going to behave like a desktop. And I think this goes back to what you're talking about with the Raspberry Pi previously as well, that simply because of the interface, we have possibly quite justified expectations of it behaving in a completely different manner.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. I reboot my phone at least once a week, and that's probably because it's CyanogenMod, and so it's never going to be quite as stable as the official ROM that comes with the phone. But with a desktop, you don't expect to have these problems, because you're tricked into thinking that it's a proper computer. And that goes back to what I said at the beginning, that these things are computers, and it's just a case of the interface and the software that they're running. And this, I think, is a valiant attempt at that, but it feels very much like a work in progress, even though it's a product that you can buy from Amazon as a retail product. The OS itself, it does feel beta, basically.
Yeah, I'd very much go along with that. And I think other expectations there, things like speed. I mean, I actually ran Antutu on this and found out that it's actually faster than my 2013 Nexus 7. It certainly didn't feel that way, but how much of that, again, is perception because I'm expecting desktop-type speed as opposed to anything else. I don't know. I certainly felt it was a very sluggish desktop.
Yeah, and we should probably point out that on the Kickstarter there were two options available, one with more and less RAM. I think it was half a gig and a gig, Joe?
I think it was 1 gig and 2 gigs. The one that we're looking at was the 2 gig version, and it had less storage as well. I think 8 gigs rather than 16. And that's the one that Paddy wanted to go for. He wanted to spend less of the listeners' money. But I said, no, with the shipping and everything, it's only a little bit more to go for the better spec'd one. And I'm glad I did, really, because I can't help but feel with half as much RAM, it would have probably been unusable. Certainly in terms of multitasking, which I think was a problem. When you did one or two things, it wasn't too bad. But I don't know if it's just the hardware isn't capable, or if Android itself just isn't capable of true multitasking. But I found that if you had too many windows open, it was very tricky to use. It wasn't a pleasure at all to use it.
It wasn't really a pleasure to use with only one app open, to be honest.
Oh, I don't know. Maybe it was just the novelty of it for me, and getting it up on and working and having windowed Android apps. I mean, I didn't try and live with it for several weeks, and I think that would be the ultimate test of it. But to me, it just feels like a stepping stone towards a future of computing. It feels that you need things like this to progress things, and where we're going to progress to, no one really knows. But this gives you a signpost, I suppose, as to what the future is going to hold for computing.
Yeah, I guess I see your point, Joe. It's perhaps one piece of the jigsaw, but you're not quite sure which direction that jigsaw's going in, because it clearly isn't convergent. It doesn't do anything apart from a desktop. But if your phone became that, it might sort of work in it was one part of the whole goal that people are aiming for. And just sort of having a thought to myself that you can buy this on Amazon for £45, and I thought, well, that's a complete waste of money. Why would you do that? But actually, if you were to buy a puck size, look at an Intel NUC. If you were to buy one of those, you're spending hundreds of pounds on a desktop. And so actually, for the price, you are getting a usable desktop, and it is a bit sluggish and all these things, but it is cheap. So while I would not recommend anyone goes and buys it, I do see what you're saying, Joe, that it's perhaps a stepping stone, or not the one that's going to lead us anywhere, but at least you've sort of looked at the future and wait for someone like Canonical to produce a truly convergent device.
Yeah, and if you think about some of the other stuff we've looked at hardware-wise, I mean, this is very similar price to the Firefox phone, for instance. And I know which device I'd rather have.
Well, you've got both now.
That's very true. Yes, I need to put this back in the post to you.
Well, I mean, in conclusion, I think that you're right, Jesse. It's cheap, and it's a way to see a glimpse of the future. And I think most importantly, Jide, the company who makes this, I think so you say that, are pretty active with development and engaging with the community of users, if not developers. And so I think we will see updates to this. It will ultimately get abandoned, but it might be that we will get enough software updates and enough development to make it what we wanted it to be. And even if it gets abandoned by the company who makes it, potentially, hopefully, maybe other developers will produce some ROMs for it and take inspiration from what they've done with Remix OS. And they've made it hackable, so you might be able to flash just straight Android on it and use it as a TV box or something. So I wouldn't say it's a complete waste of money, and it's definitely not been a wasted exercise, because I feel that it's been a very good glimpse at the cutting edge future. But I think ultimately it's a bit of a thumbs down. And with that, we're coming to the end of another Linux Luddites. You can email us at show@linuxluddites.com, find us on Twitter or at the Google Plus and Facebook communities, or leave a comment on the website. Thanks for joining me, Paddy and Jesse, and thanks to everyone for listening. We'll see you again next week for more Linux news, reviews, comment, and generally being grumpy.
Goodbye, everybody.
Goodbye, listener land.
See you later.